The spring came slow to the Kentucky hills that year, the way it always did, reluctant testing arriving in pieces rather than all at once. The frost held on through March, coating the grass each morning in white that melted by noon and returned by dark, as if the winter could not quite bring itself to admit it had lost. It was on a morning like that, caught between cold and warmth, that Rowena Vick walked down out of the hills for the first time in 5 months. She came through the tree line at the edge of the Greer property, moving steadily without hurry, the way a woman moves when she has stopped being afraid of what might be waiting for her. She was 62 years old. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her face was weathered to a darkness that hadn't been there in October, and her coat, if you could call it that, was a rough thing pieced together from materials she had worked with her own hands over the long months in the hollow. Her hair was pulled back and pinned with a sliver of bark. Her boots were worn through at the left heel and had been repaired twice with strips cut from the hem of her second dress. She looked, in other words, like someone who had been somewhere very hard and had come back from it. Opaline Greer was standing in the yard when Rowena came through the fence gap. She had a bucket in her hand, and she had been walking toward the well, but she had stopped. She stood there with the bucket handle in her fist and her mouth slightly open and her eyes doing the thing eyes do when they see something the mind has already decided cannot be real. Rowena walked past her without speaking. She did not slow down. She did not look away. She let her eyes find Opaline's for exactly as long as it took to cross the yard, and in those few seconds she said everything that needed to be said it without a single word, and then she was through the far gate and on the road to Elkhorn, and the Greer property was behind her. She did not look back. She had known she would not look back. She had known it since January, lying inside the hollow oak on a night so cold, the creek had frozen solid for the first time in 11 years, listening to the sound of her own breathing, and deciding in the particular clarity that extreme cold sometimes brings exactly what kind of woman she intended to be when spring came. But that was months away yet. To understand where Rowena Vick was going, you first had to understand where she had been. And to understand that you had to go back to October, back to the porch of the Greer farmhouse and the 50 cents and the thing that Opaline said. Rowena had come to the Greers 16 months before that March morning in the autumn of 1885, when the last of what she and Clement had built together was already gone. Clement Vick had died in the February of that year, which was early enough in the season that the ground was still too frozen to receive him properly, and they had to wait 3 days before the grave could be dug. Rowena had spent those 3 days in the house they had shared for 38 years, sitting mostly at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee that was never quite warm enough, doing the mathematics of what remained. What remained was not much. The farm had been mortgaged twice in the decade before Clement died, once when the crop failed in 1877, once when the barn burned in 1881. Clement had been a good man and a hard worker, but he had not been a lucky one. And in the hill country of Kentucky in those years, luck was the variable that determined whether hard work added up to something or simply added up to more hard work. The bank held paper on everything: the land, the equipment, the house itself. Even the kitchen table where Rowena sat with her insufficient coffee was in the strictest legal sense no longer hers. She had one daughter, Nell, who had married a railroad man and moved to Cincinnati 7 years before. She had a son, James, somewhere in Missouri, though the letters had stopped coming 2 winters back, and she had no address to write to. She had the clothes she wore, and the clothes in her trunk, and the small amount of money that had been in Clement's coat pocket on the morning he died, which amounted to $4.30. She had 62 years of life on the Kentucky hills, which meant she knew how to read weather and soil, in the behavior of animals, in the slow language of seasons. She knew how to work. She knew how to endure. What she did not know was how to be without Clement, but that was a different kind of knowledge, and it would have to wait. The bank gave her 60 days. Opaline Greer appeared at the door on the 41st day. Rowena had known Opaline the way you know people in a rural community, by reputation more than intimacy, by the occasional encounter at the general store or the church social, by what others said when her name came up. Opaline was a capable woman. That was the word people used. Capable. It covered a range of things. She ran a tight household. She kept accounts with precision. She had a quality of attention that made people feel assessed rather than seen, and she used that assessment the way a trader uses knowledge of the market to know what a thing was worth before she made her offer. She stood on Rowena's porch with her hands folded and made her proposal in the pleasant, practical tone of someone presenting terms they have already decided are reasonable. The Greer farm needed a woman who could cook, keep the house, tend the chickens, help with the preserving and the sewing, and the 100 small maintenances that kept a working homestead functioning. Harlan Opaline's husband was not a well man. His chest had been bad for 2 winters and was getting worse, and there was more work than 2 people could properly manage. Opaline's daughter Cecile was living in Lexington and showed no signs of returning. Rowena would have her own room. She would have 3 meals a day. At the end of 2 years, she would receive wages totaling $40 paid as a lump sum, and she would have, Opaline said, with the particular emphasis of someone offering something she knows cannot be refused, a place to stay for as long as she needed it. Rowena had looked at her across the threshold of the house the bank would take in 19 more days. She had asked one question. "When you say, as long as I need it, what do you mean by that?" Opaline had smiled. "I mean exactly what I said." Rowena had said yes. She understood later that this was the moment the trap closed. Not when Opaline said the words, not when Rowena agreed, but in the small, almost imperceptible pause before Opaline smiled, that fraction of a second in which something moved behind the woman's eyes that was not warmth and was not welcome, but was something far more calculated and far more cold. She understood this later. In October 1886, on the porch, 16 months. Rowena had given 16 months of her life to the Greer household, and she had given them the way she gave everything completely without reservation, with the full weight of the work ethic that 62 years of Kentucky Hill living had built into her bones. She rose before Opaline. She built the fire, started the breakfast, fed the chickens, hauled the water before either of the Greers was out of bed. She cooked 3 meals a day and cleaned what the meals dirtied, and then cleaned the rest of the house on top of that. She mended clothes and helped with the preserving, and sat with Harlan on his bad chest nights, bringing him the steam bowl and the camphor cloth that helped him breathe more easily. She did all of this with the steady, undemonstrative competence of someone who has been working hard her whole life and does not see the point of making a performance of it. And then Cecile came home. She arrived in September with a husband Rowena had never seen before, a young man named Whitfield, who worked in some capacity for a trading company in Lexington, and who looked at the Greer farmhouse with the barely concealed distaste of a person accustomed to better. Cecile herself was pleasant enough in the surface way of people who have learned that pleasantness costs nothing and reveals nothing. She kissed her mother's cheek, she shook Rowena's hand, she looked at the room Rowena slept in, the small room off the kitchen, clean and spare with its single window facing north, and she looked at it for just a moment too long. 2 weeks after Cecile arrived, Opaline called Rowena into the front room. Harlan was there, seated by the window with his hands on his knees. Cecile stood near the door. Whitfield was not present, which meant he had been given instructions, which meant this had been arranged in advance. Opaline said that circumstances had changed. Cecile and Whitfield would be staying through the winter, possibly longer. The room Rowena occupied would be needed. There was work in Elkhorn the boarding house might take her on. She was not, Opaline conceded, without a certain competence. Then Opaline placed 50 cents on the table between them. She said that the arrangement had been board and lodging in exchange for labor, and that the labor had been received and the board and lodging had been provided, and that as far as she could calculate, the account was settled. Rowena looked at the 50 cents. She looked at Harlan, who was looking out the window. She looked at Cecile, who was examining her own hands. She looked back at Opaline, who met her gaze with the steady composure of a woman who has rehearsed this moment and found it in rehearsal entirely manageable. There were no papers. There was no document that said the arrangement had been board and lodging in exchange for labor. There had been a promise of $40 and a permanent place to stay. There had been words spoken on a porch 16 months ago by a woman who chose her words carefully because she understood exactly what they were worth. But in the hill country of Kentucky in October of 1886, a woman of Rowena's station had no recourse against the spoken word of a property owner. There was no one to appeal to. There was no mechanism by which 16 months of labor could be recovered from a woman who stood in her own front room and said with perfect composure that the account was settled. Rowena picked up the 50 cents. She went to her room and put her things into the flour sack she had kept under the bed since September, which was when she had begun on some level below conscious thought to understand what was coming. 2 dresses, a wool shawl, a small tin type of Clement, taken 10 years before standing in front of the barn that had since burned. A pocket knife she had carried for so long, she could no longer remember where she had gotten it. She did not say goodbye to Harlan. She did not say anything to Cecile. She walked through the front room past Opaline, past the table where the 50 cents had been, and out onto the porch and down the steps and onto the road. The October morning was cold, frost still white on the grass. Her breath made small clouds in the air. The road to Elkhorns ran north flat and clear, 2 miles of it visible from the Greer gate. She stood at the gate for a moment. In one direction, Elkhorn, the boarding house, another kitchen, another household that was not hers, another arrangement in which she would work until she was no longer useful and then be shown the door. She was 62 years old. The boarding house might take her on as Opaline had said, or it might not. And if it did, she would spend whatever years remained to her as exactly what she had been. For the past 16 months, someone else's labor housed at someone else's sufferance, eating at someone else's table, dependent on the goodwill of people who had already demonstrated what their goodwill was worth. In the other direction, the hills. Clement had taken her into those hills 100 times in 38 years. He had taught her to read the ridges the way some men read newspapers for information, for weather, for the slow news of season and soil and the behavior of water. He had shown her which plants were useful and which were dangerous. He had shown her the springs that ran even in the worst cold, and the hollows where the deer sheltered, and the particular way the light moved through the old-growth forest on the high ridges where the trees had been standing since before anyone alive could remember. He had told her once on a September afternoon when they were walking the upper ridge and the valley was spread below them like something offered the hills, don't throw anybody out. She thought about that now. She thought about Opaline's 50 cents and Opaline's front room and the 16 months of mornings she had built fires in a house that had never been hers and never would be. Then she turned away from the Elkhorn road. She did not turn toward the hills because she had a plan. She was too honest with herself to pretend that was true. She turned toward the hills because she was 62 years old, and she had just been told in the most efficient and bloodless way possible that she was worth 50 cents and no more, and she found that she could not make herself walk toward another arrangement that would eventually reach the same conclusion. She would rather take her chances with the hills. Clement would have understood that. She was fairly certain he would have understood. She walked until the Greer farmhouse was out of sight. Then she walked more. The road gave way to a track, the track to a path, the path to no path at all. Just the natural corridors between trees that a person who knows how to walk in forest finds and follows without thinking too hard about it. The first day she made reasonable progress. Her knees were bad. They had been bad for 2 winters, and the hip that had given her trouble since the summer ached in the particular grinding way it ached when she asked more of it than it wanted to give. But she kept moving. Moving was the only option that felt like an option. The first night was bad. She found a rock overhang before dark and got herself under it and wrapped the wool shawl around her shoulders and pulled her knees to her chest. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun was gone, the way it drops in the hill country in October, and the ground beneath her was cold, and the rock above her blocked the wind, but not the cold, and she shivered through most of the night with her eyes open, listening to the forest settling into its dark rhythms around her. In the morning, everything hurt. Her hip most of all, then her hands, which had stiffened overnight and needed to be worked open slowly finger by finger before she could use them properly. She found a creek on the second day and drank from it. She found late berries on a south-facing slope, small and tart, and not many of them, but enough to put something in her stomach. She kept moving uphill because uphill was away from the valley, and away from the valley was where she needed to be. On the third day, she sat down on a fallen log because she genuinely could not walk any further. Not would not, could not. Her body had reached the end of what it would offer without protest, and it was protesting now in every joint and muscle simultaneously. And she sat on the log and looked at the ground between her boots and understood, with the calm clarity of someone past the point of panic, that she had possibly made a mistake. That the hills were not in fact going to present her with a solution simply because she had chosen them over the Elkhorn road. That she was 62 years old and had eaten almost nothing in 3 days and had slept very little and was getting colder rather than warmer as the days shortened toward November. She sat there for a long time. The forest was quiet around her. The wind moved through the high branches. A crow called from somewhere she couldn't see. She was sitting like that when she heard footsteps. He came through the trees from the north, moving slowly, picking his way around the roots and rocks with the deliberate care of someone who has learned that a fall at his age is not a small thing. He was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that suggests a person has long since stopped keeping careful track of the years because the number has ceased to carry useful information. His beard was white and tangled. His clothes had been repaired so many times that the patches had patches. His eyes were light-colored and startlingly sharp, the eyes of a man whose body had surrendered a great deal to time, but whose mind had surrendered nothing. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long moment with those sharp eyes, taking in everything: the flour sack, the worn boots, the shawl, the general condition of a woman who had been in the open for 3 days without adequate preparation. "You're dying," he said, not cruelly, simply as a statement of observable fact. Rowena looked up at him. She was past the point of being offended by accurate assessments. "Possibly," she said. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday. There were berries." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been something else. "Berries won't carry you through a Kentucky winter." He looked at her for another moment. "You got people not nearby." "Place to go?" She looked at him steadily. "If I had a place to go, I wouldn't be sitting here." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the branches above them. She waited. She had the sense that he was deciding something, but not the sense that he was uncertain about it. It was more the manner of a man who has already decided and is simply taking the time to make sure the decision is right before he acts on it. "Come with me," he said. "I'll show you something." She stood up. Her hip objected loudly. She stood up anyway. His name was August Finch. He did not tell her this immediately. He told her later, almost as an afterthought, as if names were a formality he had gotten out of the habit of observing. He lived in a cabin on the ridge, had lived there for decades, had come to these hills as a young man, and found he could not leave them. He was by any reasonable definition alone in the world, and he had been alone for long enough that solitude had become simply the condition of his existence, unremarkable and unlamented. He walked ahead of her through the forest, not fast, not slow, following a path she could not see, but that he clearly could. She followed, watching where he placed his feet, placing hers in the same positions. Her hip ground. She kept moving. They walked for perhaps 2 miles deeper into the ridge, into the part of the forest where the trees were older and larger, and the light came through in long cathedral angles that made the air feel different, cooler somehow, and very still. And then she saw the tree. It stood in a hollow between two ridgelines, and it was enormous. She had seen large oaks before. The hill country of Kentucky had old growth in the places where the timber companies had not yet reached, and she had walked among trees of considerable age and size. But this one was different. The trunk was so wide that she could not have touched her hands together around it. 3 or 4 people, the arms extended, could not have encircled it. The bark was deeply furrowed, gray, channeled, and ridged in patterns that spoke of centuries rather than decades. The branches spread overhead in all directions, massive and dark, leafless, now in October, reaching out from the central trunk like the arms of something that has decided to hold its ground for a very long time and has been succeeding. But the remarkable thing was not the size. The remarkable thing was the opening. At the base of the trunk, slightly to the north side, there was a gap, narrow, barely wide enough for a person's shoulders. The bark had healed around it in a way that suggested something very old had happened here, some injury from a lightning strike or disease or some other ancient violence, that the tree had survived and grown around over generations. But the heartwood inside had been hollowed out, and the opening gave access to a space within the trunk that was when Rowena squeezed through it and stood inside a chamber roughly 6 feet across and 8 feet tall. The walls were smooth, dark wood seasoned by a century of its own interior climate, solid as stone. The floor was deep in old leaf litter. The air inside was still, completely still, in the way that only enclosed spaces are still, with no movement at all. And it was warm, not warm like a heated room, but noticeably, measurably warmer than the October air outside. The thick walls of heartwood oak absorbed and held what heat they could find from the thin October sun, from the earth below, from the simple fact of being enclosed, and released it slowly into the interior space. The difference was perhaps 10 degrees. In October, that was interesting. In January, that might be everything. August stood at the entrance and watched her examine the space with those sharp, light-colored eyes. "Oak holds heat," he said. "2 feet of heartwood between you and the wind. Rain can't reach you. Snow piles up outside and adds another layer of insulation. I spent 2 winters in that tree before I built the cabin. Rowena ran her hand along the interior wall. It was warm under her palm. She thought about the night before under the rock overhang, shivering. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she recognized, the flatness of someone saying something true that they would rather not have to say. "Because I'm not going to be here much longer," he said, "and I wanted someone to know this tree was here before I wasn't." He reached into his coat and brought out a hunting knife, the blade worn thin from decades of sharpening, the handle worn smooth from decades of use. He held it out to her. "This is what I can give you. The rest you'll have to work out yourself." She took the knife. It was lighter than it looked and heavier than it looked. "Both things at once. Was. You have maybe 3 weeks before the real cold comes," he said. "That tree will keep you alive, but only if you make it ready. Seal the gaps. Build your fire outside the entrance. Small fire, hot wood, no smoke. Dry wood makes heat. Wet wood makes smoke. Don't forget the difference." He paused. "The Greer farm is in the valley below. If you can see their chimney from the ridge, they can see yours if you're careless." She looked at him. "You know the Greers." "I know everybody who's been in this valley for 20 years. He said it without inflection. "Come spring, go to Crawford's Mill in Elkhorn. Tell him August Finch sent you. He'll give you work." He turned and walked back into the forest the way he had come. She stood in the entrance of the hollow oak and watched him go. She did not call after him. She did not ask his age, or where he had come from, or why he had spent his life alone on this ridge. She understood with the instinct of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the important moments that those were not the questions that mattered. The question that mattered was the one she was already answering with her hands. She went back inside the tree and began to think about what needed to be done. 3 weeks. That was what August had given her, and she believed him because he was the kind of man whose assessments came from observation rather than opinion. 3 weeks before the real cold. 3 weeks to turn a hollow in a tree into something that could keep a 62-year-old woman alive through the worst that Kentucky winter could offer. She started that afternoon. The leaf litter on the floor was old and damp, compressed into a mat that would hold moisture and steal heat from anyone sleeping on it. She cleared it all out, carrying armload after armload through the narrow entrance and scattering it outside. Then she went up the slope to the ridge where the pines grew and cut boughs from the lower branches with the knife August had given her, carrying them back down to the hollow in bundles. Pine needles were wax and water-resistant, and they smelled clean, and she piled them 2 feet deep on the floor of the tree and covered them with a layer of the driest leaves she could find. It took most of the first day. Her hip ached throughout. She worked until she could not see clearly, then stopped, ate the last of the berries she had been carrying, and slept inside the tree on the bed she had just made. She woke up warmer than she had been in 4 days. That was the first confirmation. The second task was the gaps. The entrance was not tight. There were places where cold air could find its way through around the edges, and there were smaller cracks in the bark, old wounds the tree had not fully healed over. She gathered clay from the bank of a creek she found a quarter-mile downhill, mixing it with dried grass the way she had seen Adobe described once in a book, working it into a rough mortar that she packed into every gap she could find. The entrance she fitted with a piece of bark pried from a dead tree nearby, hanging it on a hinge of twisted vine. The third task was fire, and this was the task she thought about most carefully because August had been clear. Smoke was the danger. Not fire. Smoke. She experimented. She built small fires just outside the entrance in a pit she dug and lined with creek stones, using only the driest wood she could find, dead falls, not green timber, not damp bark. The smoke from dry wood burned hot and thin and dispersed quickly in the air, above the hollow, invisible against the gray October sky. The heat from the stones radiated inward through the entrance, warming the interior without filling it with fumes. She learned to bank the coals at night, burying them in ash to hold their heat until morning. She learned other things in those 3 weeks, which berries were past their season and which were not. Where the creek ran with a current strong enough to keep it from freezing over in the worst cold. Which sections of the forest floor would yield roots even after frost. How to move through the trees quietly and how to stay still, and what the difference was between a sound that meant something and a sound that was simply the forest going about its business. She had known some of these things before Clement had taught her, or she had learned them in 40 years of living close to the land. But knowing something and depending on it are different things, and in those 3 weeks of preparation, she crossed the line between the two permanently and without return. At the end of the third week, the first snow fell. She was ready. She stood in the entrance of the hollow oak on the morning the snow began and watched it come down through the old growth trees, soft and steady, covering the forest floor in white, and she felt something she had not felt since she walked away from the Greer farmhouse. Not happiness, something older and simpler than happiness. She felt like herself. She went inside, pulled the bark door closed behind her, and began the long work of surviving the winter that Opaline Greer had sent her into. The winter that was going to prove one long, cold night at a time exactly what Rowena Vick was worth. 50 cents, Opaline had said. The oak walls were 2 feet thick. The pine boughs were deep and dry beneath her. The banked coals in the fire pit outside were holding their heat. And somewhere down in the valley below the chimney of the Greer farmhouse was just beginning its long, slow, desperate effort to keep up with a winter it had not properly prepared for. The tree held. The woman inside it held with it. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and indifferent, covering everything equally. The hollow oak on the ridge, the Greer farmhouse in the valley, the road to Elkhorn, the grave on the eastern hill where Clement Vick had been sleeping since February, covering all of it the same way, making no distinctions. That was the snow's business. Rowena's business was something else. She had work to do and the winter to do it in, and she intended to come out the other side. November arrived without apology. It came the way hard things come to the Kentucky hills, not announced, not gradual, but simply present one morning in a way it had not been the morning before. Rowena woke on the first day of the month to find the creek she had been drinking from reduced to a thin, dark thread between ice shelves and the temperature outside the hollow oak so far below what it had been the week before that the difference felt like a different season entirely, which of course it was. She lay still for a moment in the darkness of the tree, listening. The pine boughs beneath her had compressed over the weeks into something denser and more efficient than they had started as still insulating but closer to the ground now, which meant she would need to add more layers before the deep cold came. The bark door she had hung on its vine hinge was holding against the overnight air, and the clay mortar she had packed into the gaps was mostly intact, though 2 sections near the upper entrance had cracked and would need to be repacked before the first real snow pressed ice into the fissures and expanded them. She took inventory the way she always took inventory, mentally, systematically, starting from the most immediate problem and working outward. The fire pit outside needed fresh stones. Her root supply, cached in a shallow depression she had dug into the floor of the hollow and covered with bark, was adequate for another 2 weeks if she rationed carefully. The creek would freeze solid within the month, which meant she needed to identify the spring. August had mentioned the one that ran even in the worst cold before she lost access to open water. She rose, worked her hands open in the way she had developed over these weeks, slow and deliberate, starting with the smallest fingers and working inward, giving the joints time to accept the day. Pulled on every garment she owned in the correct order and ducked through the entrance into the gray November morning. Her breath came out in a plume and stayed visible for longer than it had in October. She had 3 problems. She had always had 3 problems. The number didn't change, only the specific problems did, cycling through in a rotation that she had come to think of as simply the work. Food, warmth, water. Solve all 3 every day in the right order without expending more energy solving them than you recovered from solving them. That was the equation. That was all it was when you stripped everything else away. Clement would have said she was oversimplifying. He had always thought in more dimensions than she did, more possibilities, more connections, more concern for what might go wrong beyond the immediate horizon. She thought in straight lines. One problem, then the next. He had loved this about her and found it exasperating in equal measure, and she had loved him for both reactions. She pushed the thought of him back to where she kept it, not buried, not suppressed, but held at the distance necessary to function, and went to work. The spring August had described was a quarter-mile south of the hollow oak, lower on the ridge tucked into a fold of rock where the hillside changed angle. She found it on her second full day of searching, following the logic he had given her. Look for the fold, look for the rock, look for the water that doesn't stop. And when she found it, she sat beside it for a moment with her hand in the current and felt the cold of it and the steadiness of it, and understood why August had told her it was worth finding. The spring ran from a crack in the limestone bedrock, a crack deep enough that the seasonal cold could not reach its source, and it came out at a temperature that would keep it liquid through any winter the hill country could produce. The water was clean and cold, and it ran at a pace that could fill a vessel in minutes. She could reach it in 15 minutes from the hollow oak. That was manageable. She marked the path carefully, a notch cut into a tree trunk at each turning point, small enough to be invisible to anyone not looking for it, clear enough to follow in the dark or in snow. She had learned in the first weeks that the forest looked entirely different, in different light, in different weather, and that a path you knew perfectly in October could become unrecognizable in December when the landmarks were buried and the shadows fell differently. She was learning things. That was what she told herself on the difficult days when her body was making its complaints known and the root cache was getting lower and the temperature was dropping in ways she had not fully prepared for. She was learning things. Every day of survival was also a day of education, and the education was expensive, paid in physical discomfort and caloric deficiency, in the particular mental taxation of managing fear. But it was real and it was hers, and no one could put it in a flour sack and take it away from her. 2 weeks into November, she climbed to the upper ridge to look at the valley. It was a clear day, cold and bright, the sky a particular shade of blue that only appears in late autumn when the air has been cleaned of everything soft and what remains is pure and unambiguous. From the upper ridge, she could see the valley spread below her, the creek bottoms, the patchwork of farms, the road to Elkhorn, running its straight line through the center of it all. She could see the Greer farmhouse. It was smaller from this distance than it felt in memory. A white structure with a gray roof, the barn behind it, the chicken coop to the south, the kitchen garden plot visible as a dark rectangle against the frost-killed grass of the yard. The chimney was working. She could see the smoke rising from it, thin and steady, the smoke of a fire that was doing its job without being pushed past its means. They had enough fuel yet. That was clear from the smoke. The smoke of a fire burning, controlled and adequate, was different from the smoke of a fire being driven hard to compensate for cold. It was losing ground too. She knew the difference. She had managed fires in this hill country for 38 years. And fire is a language you learn to read the way you learn to read any language, by paying attention until the meaning becomes automatic. For now, the Greer fire was telling her nothing interesting. She turned away from the valley and went back down to the hollow. It was on the 17th of November that she went to find August Finch. She had questions she had not thought to ask him in October, when she had been too cold and too exhausted and too stunned by the sudden reversal of her circumstances to think clearly about what she needed to know. She wanted to ask him about trapping. She had the knife, and she had been watching the animals long enough to have some sense of their patterns, but she had no line and no proper trap and no instruction in the specifics of how to turn observation into food. She wanted to ask him about the winter of 1874, which the old-timers said had been the worst in living memory, and which would tell her something about the outer limits of what she was preparing for. She had been putting off the visit for reasons she did not fully examine, and she understood walking up toward the ridge where his cabin stood that the reasons were probably something to do with not wanting to depend on anyone, not even an old man who had already decided to help her and asked nothing in return. She had spent 16 months depending on the Greers. She was done with depending, but this was different. She told herself it was different, and she believed it was different, though she could feel the effort of the belief. August had given freely. August had expected nothing. That was a different transaction than the one Apolline had proposed on her porch in 1885, and she needed to stop treating them as the same. The cabin came into view through the trees. Small, solid, well-chinked, the kind of structure that a man builds when he is planning to stay and has enough years ahead of him to make the work of doing it right seem worthwhile. The door was closed. The chimney was cold. She stopped. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin, at the cold chimney and the closed door and the stillness that surrounded it, and she understood before she put her hand on the door latch what she was going to find. She opened the door anyway. He was in his bed, which was a narrow thing against the far wall, covered in layers of worn blankets. He looked at first glance like a man sleeping. He looked at second glance like a man who had decided to stop. His face was relaxed in the particular way that only comes when every tension a person has ever carried is finally permanently released. His hands were folded on his chest. The cabin was cold but not freezing. The fire had been out for perhaps 2 days. She stood in the doorway for a while. She had thought she was past the point where death could surprise her. She had buried a husband. She had buried 2 children before they were grown, back in the years when that was simply the price the hill country sometimes charged for the children you raised. She knew what death looked like, and she had made her peace with it as a fact of the world the way you make peace with weather. But August Finch had given her something. He had given it without being asked, without expectation, with the simple generosity of someone who sees a need and fills it, because filling it is the right thing to do. And now he was gone, and she was alone on this ridge in a way she had not fully been when he was alive in his cabin 2 miles away. She closed the door carefully. She stood in the cold clearing for a moment. Then she walked back down to the hollow oak. She did not let herself stop and feel what she was feeling until she was inside with the bark door pulled closed behind her in the dark and the warmth of the tree. Then she sat down on the pine boughs and put her hands on her knees and let the full weight of it settle. Not just August, all of it. The 16 months, the 50 cents, the flour sack, Clement in the frozen ground, the bank's paper on everything she had built, the Elkhorn road she had not taken, the 3 weeks of preparation that had been the hardest physical work of her life, the knowledge that no one in the world knew where she was, that no one would come if she needed help, that she was operating without margin of any kind, no savings, no allies, no second chances. She sat with all of it for a while. Then she thought about what August had shown her. Not the tree, she already had the tree. She thought about what he had shown her by example, which was something different and more durable. He had come to these hills as a young man with nothing, and had made a life from what the hills offered, and he had lived that life for decades, and he had died in his own bed with his hands folded on his chest and his face at rest. That was not nothing. That was in fact quite a lot. She got up and added wood to the fire pit and put water on to boil and took stock of her stores with careful attention, and by the time she went to sleep that night, she had a plan for the rest of November and a rough plan for December, and the fear had not gone away, but it had moved to a manageable distance. The tree was warm around her. The pine boughs were deep beneath her. Outside, the wind moved through the high branches, and the forest made its nighttime sounds, and the ridge held steady against whatever the sky intended to send. She slept. December arrived and brought its full weight. The snow came in earnest on the 3rd day of the month, not the exploratory flurries of November, but a sustained fall that lasted 2 days and left 3 feet of it on the ground. The hollow filled in the gap between ridgelines, the snow packing against the north side of the oak, until the tree had an additional wall of white insulation that Rowena had not planned for and found when she pressed her hand into it more solid and useful than she would have expected. Snow, she was learning, was not simply a difficulty, it was also a resource. It was water when you melted it. It was insulation when it packed against a structure. It was information. It showed her the tracks of every animal that had moved through the hollow since the last fall, a map of the ridge's invisible population drawn fresh each morning. She read it the way August had read the forest, with attention and without romanticism, looking for what was useful. What was useful was the rabbit population. She had no traps. She had a knife, and she had patience, and she had the observation of weeks to tell her where the rabbits ran and when. She spent 3 days in early December sitting still, in places she had identified as crossing points, wrapped in everything she owned, barely breathing, waiting. On the 3rd day, she came back to the hollow with 2 rabbits. She cooked them over the fire pit that evening and ate slowly and carefully, saving what she could for the next day, using every part of the animal the way she had been taught and the way necessity reinforced. The bones went into the pot with creek water and a section of dried root to make a broth that stretched the nutrition further than the meat alone. The skins she stretched and dried, beginning the slow accumulation that would eventually become something she could use for additional warmth. She was 15 pounds lighter than she had been in October. She knew it without a scale, knew it in the way her clothes hung, and the way the cold found her more easily than it had the insulating layer of her body reduced to something closer to the minimum. It was not comfortable. She did not pretend it was comfortable, but it was survivable, and the difference between those two things was the whole of what she needed. On the 21st of December, she climbed to the upper ridge again. The valley below was white and still. The farms softened under their covering of snow into shapes that looked almost gentle. the hardness of the work they represented concealed beneath the season's blanket. The Greer chimney was working differently than it had in November. She saw it as soon as she looked. The smoke was heavier, not the thin, controlled stream of a fire burning at the right rate, but a denser, darker output that spoke of wood being driven hard. Wood being asked to produce more heat than it could cleanly provide. Wood that was perhaps not quite dry enough, not quite the right type, not quite what you would choose if you had the luxury of choosing. She watched the chimney for a while. She thought about what the smoke was saying. Opaline Greer was a capable woman, everyone said so, and Rowena had lived in her house long enough to confirm it. Capable at managing, capable at accounting, capable at arranging the affairs of her household to maximize what she received and minimize what she paid. But there was a specific kind of knowledge that capability of that type did not necessarily include. The knowledge of how much fuel a hill country farmhouse consumed in a hard winter. The knowledge of how to read a winter coming so you could lay in what you needed before the worst of it arrived. Harlan had known. Harlan had managed the fuel supply for years the way men in that valley managed the things that required reading the land rather than managing the household. But Harlan's chest had been bad for 2 winters and getting worse, and Rowena had sat with him on enough bad nights to understand that the work of the previous autumn had not been done with his usual thoroughness. And now Cecile's husband Whitfield was in the house, a man from Lexington who worked for a trading company and who had looked at the farmhouse with poorly concealed distaste. She doubted Whitfield knew anything useful about fuel. She watched the chimney a while longer. Then she turned away from the valley and started back down through the snow to the hollow oak. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not the particular warmth of watching a difficulty visit someone who had earned it. What she felt was something closer to recognition. The hills were not delivering justice. The hills did not deal in justice. They dealt in consequence, the straightforward, impersonal consequence of preparation meeting circumstance or failing to. Opaline had prepared for many things. She had prepared the bitten of paper, the polished dismissal, the performance in the front room with Harlan looking out the window. She had not prepared adequately for January. That was not justice. That was simply the way things were. The worst night came on the 28th of December. She knew it was coming before it arrived the way she had learned to know things on the ridge by reading what the air was doing and what the sky was suggesting and what the animals were not doing that they would normally be doing. The birds had gone quiet 2 days before. The rabbits had disappeared from their usual crossings. The temperature had been dropping steadily since the 25th in a way that felt less like seasonal variation and more like a direction being chosen and committed to. She spent the 27th preparing. She packed every gap she could find in the bark walls with additional clay and dried grass, working until her fingers were stiff and then warming them inside her coat and working again. She brought in enough fuel to bank the fire pit for 2 full days without needing to go out for more. She filled every vessel she had with water from the spring, carrying load after load up the slope in the last hours before dark because she knew that if it got cold enough, the spring itself might slow to something she could not count on, and she would need what she had cached in the hollow. She pulled the bark door as tight as it would go and packed the edges with clay, and then with dried grass pressed into the remaining gaps, and she sat inside the tree in the last of the light and looked at what she had built over these months: the deep pine bough floor, the clay-packed walls, the careful ceiling of the heartwood hollow far above her, the fire's warmth moving inward through the narrow entrance to fill the chamber with something that was not comfort but was survival, which was what mattered. The night came down. Outside, the temperature dropped to places that Rowena had no instrument to measure and would not have believed if she had. The wind moved through the upper ridge with a sustained force that she heard as a constant pressure against the world beyond the tree's walls, a pressure that pressed the cold inward through every molecule of air and every imperfection in every surface. Inside the hollow, the temperature dropped too steadily, inexorably, the fire's heat fighting a retreating action against the cold that was winning the perimeter even as it held the center. She pulled everything she had around her: the wool shawl, the dried rabbit skins she had accumulated over the past weeks wrapped around her shoulders, the spare dress over the dress she wore. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed herself into the deepest corner of the hollow where 3 walls of heartwood wood met, and the temperature was marginally higher than the center of the space. She thought about Clement. She thought about him deliberately, which was something she had been cautious about doing, because she knew the thought of him could become a place to disappear into rather than a place to draw from. But tonight was a night for drawing, and she drew from him deliberately and with purpose. She thought about the first winter they had spent together in the original dugout on their first piece of land, when they had been young and unprepared and frightened, and had survived by pressing together and sharing what warmth they had between them. She thought about his hands, which had been large and very warm, and how she had put her feet against them on cold mornings, and how he had never once objected. She thought about what he had said on the ridge on that September afternoon, with the valley spread below them. The hills don't throw anybody out. She was still here. That was the argument. She was cold and thin and alone, and she had been eating things she could not always name, and sleeping in a tree and spending every hour of every day in direct negotiation with the possibility of dying, but she was still here. The tree was still here. The walls were still 2 feet thick. The fire was still holding something at the center of the hollow that was not warm but was not lethal. And the difference between those two things was the whole of the argument. She stayed awake most of the night. Not from panic. Panic requires a belief that the situation can be changed by the right response, and she was past that kind of thinking. She stayed awake because sleeping in extreme cold is itself a risk, and she was not willing to take risks she did not have to take. Toward morning, the temperature shifted, not dramatically, not enough to call it a change. But there was something different in the quality of the cold, some loosening of the absolute grip it had been maintaining, and she recognized it the way you recognize the first sign of any important thing, not with certainty, not with relief, but with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to celebrate until the evidence is conclusive. She waited. The light came thin and cold and pale through the gap in the bark door. She was still alive. 3 days after the cold broke, a trapper came through the ridge. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of someone moving through snow-covered forest is distinct. The compression and creak of the surface. The different sound of human weight and human rhythm against the random sounds of animals. And she came out of the hollow to meet him because she had learned that encountering strangers on the ridge was better done in the open than from concealment. He was a weathered man of middle years with a pack of furs and a rifle, and the self-contained manner of someone who spends most of his time alone. He stopped when he saw her and took in the situation, the hollow oak, the fire pit, the small cache of supplies visible near the entrance, the state of the woman standing in front of him, and he processed it all with the practical equanimity of a man who has seen a variety of situations in his years in the hill country and has stopped being surprised by them. They talked for a while. He told her what the winter had been like further north, which was worse than what she had experienced, and confirmed that her preparation had been better than she had known to hope. She told him nothing specific about herself, and he did not ask because in the hill country in 1886, that was simply good manners. Before he left, he told her about the Greers. He had come through the valley, he said, in the last week, past the Greer farm. The place was in a bad state, that was how he put it, without elaboration, the way hill country people describe misfortune without dwelling on it. The fencing was being burned. The barn needed work that wasn't getting done. The husband had gone out in a storm 2 weeks before to find wood and had not come back. They found Harlan Greer 300 yards from his own house, the trapper said. In a drift, he had gotten turned around in the white. Rowena stood in the snow outside the hollow oak and received this information. She let it settle into the same place where she kept everything else that had happened since October the 50 cents. The flour sack, the cold nights, August's folded hands on his blankets. She let it settle, and she did not try to make it mean something it didn't mean. Harlan Greer had been a man who looked out windows, a man who sat by the fire on bad nights while someone else brought the steam bowl and the camphor cloth. A man who had been present for 16 months of her labor and had said nothing, done nothing, offered nothing. Not out of cruelty, she thought, but out of the particular passivity of someone who had long ago ceded the decisions to the person beside him and lost the capacity to act independently. He had gone out in a storm to find wood. That meant the wood had run out. That meant Opaline's calculations, so precise in so many respects, had not extended far enough into January to account for what January actually cost. The trapper asked if she knew the family. She said she had known them once. He nodded. He mentioned as he readjusted his pack to leave that the widow was asking around Elkhorn for help. The farm was falling apart without her husband, and she needed strong hands willing to work. He said this without particular emphasis as a piece of information rather than a suggestion. But he watched her face when he said it, and she understood that he had figured out more about her situation than she had told him, because observant men in the hill country usually did. Rowena thought about Opaline standing in her front room, about the front room itself, which she had swept and dusted and polished for 16 months, about the table where the 50 cents had been placed. She thought about strong hands willing to work, about room and board, about the way an arrangement could be described in one set of words and mean something else entirely, and how the difference between the description and the meaning then only became clear when you were already inside it with no way out. She looked at the trapper. "I don't think I can help her," she said. He shrugged. He said he had figured as much. He mentioned that from what he heard, the widow was offering room and board in exchange for labor. No wages, just charity was how she was putting it. He said this with a neutrality that contained within it a very specific judgment. Then he went on his way up the ridge toward wherever the next part of his circuit took him, his footsteps compressing the snow in the regular rhythm of a man who has somewhere to be and knows how to get there. Rowena watched him go. Then she turned back to the hollow oak. The fire pit needed fresh wood. The root cache needed to be checked against what the coming weeks would require. The clay seals on the north side of the entrance had cracked in the last cold snap and needed repacking before the next one came. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and she was, by any measure that mattered on this January day on this Kentucky ridge, still the one doing it. She went inside and began. January gave way to February, the way a man with bad intentions gives way to a door reluctantly without conceding the point, looking for another way in. Rowena felt the change in the quality of the cold more than she measured it by any external sign. The cold of February on the Kentucky ridge was different from the cold of January, the way a fire that has been burning a long time is different from one that has just been lit deeper, more settled into everything. It touched, more confident of its hold on the surfaces it occupied. January cold arrived. February cold resided. She had been inside the hollow oak for 4 months. In those 4 months, she had learned things that she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life, regardless of what the rest of her life looked like. The way you carry things that were taught at great, not on the surface where they can be put down and picked up at will, but deeper in the layer below. Conscious thought where the most important knowledge lives. She had learned that the body's complaints, which she had spent 62 years treating as signals requiring response, were actually negotiations. The hip that ground and protested in the first weeks of October had not stopped grinding and protesting. It had simply become part of the landscape of her daily existence, a condition to be managed rather than a problem to be solved, and somewhere in November she had stopped waiting for it to stop and started working with it the way you work with difficult terrain, finding the path of least resistance, pacing accordingly. Stopping when stopping was the intelligent choice and not before November. She had learned that hunger was the same, that the body's insistence on adequate nutrition was real and required attention, but was also within the limits of what she could provide, negotiable. A handful of nuts and a boiled root was not a meal in any sense she would have used the word in October. By January, it was sufficient, and her understanding of the word had adjusted to fit the reality rather than the other way around. She had learned that silence was not empty. The ridge was never truly quiet, and in 4 months she had learned to read its sounds the way she had learned to read the smoke from the valley chimneys for information, for warning, for the news that the landscape was always delivering to anyone patient enough to listen. The specific silence that preceded snow, the change in bird behavior that indicated temperature about to drop, the sound of ice moving in the creek that told her whether the spring above was still running free or beginning to slow. These things were hers now. They had been purchased at a price she would not have willingly agreed to pay in October, and she did not pretend otherwise. But they were hers and no one could take them, and that counted for something that she did not yet have the right word for. February passed in the rhythm she had established, fire, water, food, shelter, each one attended to in its correct order, each one sufficient if not comfortable, each one a small proof that the equation was still working. She lost no additional weight in February, which she took as a sign that the balance had stabilized at something sustainable. The rabbit population remained active on the ridge, and she had developed over the winter an effectiveness at waiting and watching that had nothing to do with trapping and everything to do with patience. The patience of someone who has no alternative to patience and has therefore made peace with it. The cold broke on the 14th of February, which she knew because the creek ice cracked in a way she had not heard since October. A series of long reports in the early morning that sounded like the ridge itself was clearing its throat. She lay in the hollow oak and listened to it and understood what it meant. Not yet spring was weeks away, but the grip loosening at last, the absolute authority of January's cold giving way to something less certain of itself. Something that could still kill you if you were careless, but was no longer looking for you specifically. She let herself feel the relief of it. She had been careful through the winter not to let herself feel things that cost more than she could afford, not despair in the dark hours, not hope in the better ones, because both required a transaction with the future that she could not fund, while the present was demanding everything she had. But the breaking of the deep cold was not the future. It was the present, and she let herself feel it sitting inside the hollow oak in the early morning, with the sound of the ice releasing in the creek and the light coming through the bark door with a quality she had not seen since autumn. She sat with it for a long time. Then she got up and went to check the spring. March came in the way the old-timers said, like a lion, as if it had an argument to finish before it would consider stepping aside. Two storms in the first week, both serious, both demanding her full attention and her full supply of what the preparation of the previous months had built. She weathered them inside the hollow oak with the steady practicality she had developed, doing what needed to be done without drama. And when they were over, she came out into the white aftermath and looked at the damage and found it manageable. The clay seals on the north face had needed repacking twice more. The vine hinge on the bark door had finally given way and needed to be replaced with a length of bark cut into strips and woven together which held better than the vine had and which she noted for the future, though what the future looked like she had not yet let herself think too specifically about. Crawford's Mill. August had told her Crawford's Mill in Elkhorn. She turned the name over in her mind on the long evenings when the work of the day was done and the fire was banked and the hollow was warming toward the temperature that allowed sleep. Crawford's Mill. Come spring, tell him August sent you. August was 4 months in his cabin on the ridge, cold as the winter he had lived through a dozen times too many. She had gone back once in December to make sure the door was shut tight enough to keep the animals out. She had done what she could for him, which was not much but was something, and she had said what she could say over a man who had given her everything he had left and expected nothing in return, which was also not much, but was true. She would go to Crawford's Mill. She would work for wages, real wages paid in cash, not balanced against a ledger of room and board that someone else controlled. She would save. She would accumulate coin by coin, the thing that made a difference between someone else's arrangements and her own. She would do it slowly because, at 62 with a bad hip and a hard winter behind her, she could not do it quickly, and quickly had never been the point anyway. The point was to finish standing. The snow was still on the ground in the hollows on the morning she decided to come down, but the south-facing slopes were bare and the creek in the valley was running with snowmelt, and the air carried something she had not smelled since October. The dark, rich, complicated smell of ground thawing of the soil, waking up to the new season with the unhurried reliability that soil had always managed regardless of what the winter had been. She packed what she had. It was not much, and most of it she left the clay patch walls and the pine bough floor, and the fire pit lined with creek stones and the bark door on its new hinge. She left them because someone might need them, the way August had left her the knowledge of the tree because he understood someone might need it. The knife she kept, the rabbit skins she had accumulated over the winter rolled and tied with bark strips, a small quantity of dried roots and nuts that she had held in reserve through the worst of February against a need that had not come. She came out of the hollow oak on a morning in late March and stood in the light of it, thin, still the light of a season that has not yet committed itself fully, and she put her hand against the bark of the tree. The outer bark was cold, the cold of a surface that has spent the night in contact with the open air. But 6 inches in beneath the furrowed exterior, 2 feet of heartwood held the temperature of the earth itself, the slow, deep warmth that the seasons could not touch. She had spent 5 months inside those walls. She had gone in a woman who had been given 50 cents and told she was worth exactly that. She was coming out someone else. Not a different person, the same person, but clarified. The way metal is clarified by the process that tests it, not changed in its essential nature, but rid of everything that was not essential. She took her hand off the bark and turned toward the valley. The Greer farm came into view as she descended the final ridge, and she looked at it with the eyes of someone seeing a place from the outside after a long time inside her own head, which gives everything a slightly different scale than memory holds. It was smaller than memory. That was always true. The farmhouse looked diminished somehow, not in its physical dimensions, but in the authority it had carried in her recollection of it. For 16 months, it had been the whole of her world. Every room she had cleaned and reheated and maintained, every meal she had cooked in its kitchen, every morning she had risen before the Greers to build its fire. It had been in the way that a place of involuntary habitation becomes her context, the frame within which her daily existence occurred. From the ridge, it looked like what it was. A farmhouse in a valley, one of several, no larger than its neighbors, no more significant, nothing about it that distinguished it from the other structures in the valley except that she happened to know its interior better than she knew her own face. She could see even from this distance the gaps in the fencing where rails had been pulled and burned. She could see the barn with its sagging roof line, the kind of sag that develops when a winter's worth of snow has not been cleared, and the structure has been making decisions about what it can bear without anyone paying attention. The kitchen garden was brown and flat, the way an untended garden looks in late March, not hopeless, but not tended. She came through the fence gap on the south end of the property in the middle of the morning and walked across the yard. Opaline Greer was there. She was standing near the well with a bucket in her hand, and she had stopped mid-motion, the bucket suspended at the end of her arm, neither raised nor lowered, arrested in place by the sight of what was coming across her yard. She was wearing the same dark dress she had worn on the day in October, or one very like it, but something about the way it hung suggested it fit differently than it had. Opaline had always been a woman who wore her clothes with the precision of someone accustomed to presenting herself correctly. The dress was not presenting itself correctly. Rowena walked toward her and then past her, angled to take her toward the far gate, the one that opened onto the Elkhorn Road. She did not slow down. She looked at Opaline as she crossed the yard and looked at her directly, the way she had promised herself she would if this moment came. And in those few seconds, she saw what 5 months had done to the woman who had placed 50 cents on her front room table and called it settled. Opaline looked like someone who had been running an account she did not fully understand and had only recently seen the final number. The precision was still there. It was built too deep to be dismantled in a single winter, but something underneath the precision had shifted. Something that had to do with the particular confidence that comes from believing you have anticipated every important variable and the particular shock of discovering that you have not. Rowena did not speak. She did not need to speak. She had known since January, lying in the hollow oak on the night the temperature reached its lowest point, that she would not need to speak. That the argument had already been made, was being made, was complete in the fact of her being here and walking, and the farm being in the condition it was in, and Harlan being in the ground, and the winter having said in its own impersonal and irrefutable way everything that needed to be said. She went through the far gate and onto the Elkhorn Road and did not look back. Elkhorn was 2 miles down the valley road, and she walked it at the pace her hip permitted, which was not fast but was steady, the same steadiness she had applied to everything since October. The morning was cold, but not the cold of winter, the cold of transition of a season in the process of becoming something else, which is a very different thing. She passed the church and the general store and the blacksmith and came to Crawford's Mill at the edge of town where the creek ran strong enough in spring to power the wheel. It was a working mill, loud and purposeful, with the smell of cut timber and the sound of men at labor, and the general atmosphere of a place where useful things were being done. She went to the door and knocked, and when a man appeared, she told him August Finch had sent her. The man's expression changed, not dramatically, but the way a face changes when a name it respects is spoken by a stranger, a small recalibration, a reassessment. His name was Crawford. He was a compact, practical man in his middle 40s with the hands of someone who works alongside his hired help rather than directing them from a distance. He asked her 2 questions. Could she cook for 8 men on a wood stove with whatever the supply wagon delivered? And could she start tomorrow? She said yes to both. He told her the wage. It was $1 a week, paid in cash on Fridays, plus room in the storage building that had a proper stove and a cot and a bolt on the in-pod of the door. She could eat with the crew or she could eat separately as she preferred. She preferred separately, she said, at least until she knew the shape of things. He nodded as if this was reasonable, which it was, and showed her the kitchen and the storeroom and the arrangement of the place, and she listened and looked and filed everything away with the systematic attention she had developed over 5 months of needing to know everything that was true about her environment. She started the next morning. The work at Crawford's Mill was not easy, but it was the kind of not easy she was accustomed to: physical, repetitive, demanding full attention, and reasonable physical capacity, governed by clear expectations and compensated by the agreed-upon wage. She cooked for 8 men 3 times a day on a wood stove that she learned in the first week the way she learned everything, by paying attention until the behavior became automatic. The men were what men in working situations are: largely indifferent to her, except as the person responsible for their meals, occasionally decent, occasionally not worth the effort, nobody's enemy and nobody's friend. She kept to herself with the self-contained manner she had developed on the ridge, and they respected it without particularly understanding it, which was all the relationship required. On Fridays, Crawford put $1 in her hand. She kept the money in a cloth purse she wore inside her dress against her skin, where the warmth of her body kept it dry. Every Friday she added $1. She did not spend what she did not have to spend. She ate the mill's food, wore the clothes she had repaired, what wore out, rather than replacing it. She did not go to the boarding house or the general store for anything she could do without. After the first month, she had $4. After 3 months, she had 12. The arithmetic of it was slow, and the slowness required a patience she had learned in a hollow oak on a Kentucky ridge, and she applied that patience to the accumulation of dollars the same way she had applied it to the accumulation of rabbit skins, without drama, without hurry, 1 unit at a time. She heard news of the Greer farm, as she heard all the valley news in pieces, and without seeking from the men at the mill, from the storekeeper who supplied the kitchen, from the occasional woman she spoke to on the road between the mill and wherever she happened to be going. The farm was struggling. Opaline had hired help, but the help did not stay. The barn roof had been repaired badly and would need to be repaired again. The crop that spring was poor, partly from the hard winter and partly from the inattention that grief and difficulty produce in even the most capable people. Rowena received all of this with the neutrality she had developed for information that was not hers to act on. She had not forgiven Opaline Greer. She had not decided that what Opaline had done was understandable, or that the passage of time and the arrival of consequence had balanced the account. The account was not balanced. The account would not be balanced by anything that happened to Opaline, because what had been taken from Rowena was not the kind of thing that could be restored by watching someone else suffer. What had been taken was 16 months. The specific 16 months between the autumn of 1885 and the autumn of 1886, when Rowena had been doing the work of a woman rebuilding herself after the loss of everything, and Opaline had redirected that work into the maintenance of her own household. Those months were gone. Their absence did not diminish when Harlan died in a drift, or when the barn roof sagged, or when Opaline could not find help that would stay. The loss was the loss, fixed and permanent, and it sat beside the other losses in the place where Rowena kept such things, which was not in front of her where it would interfere with the work, but not behind her either where it could be forgotten. She kept it where she could see it clearly when she needed to. She did not need to very often. She had other things to look at. 3 years passed, 3 years of Fridays and the $1 in the cloth purse and the work that was hard but honest and the room with the bolt on the inside of the door. 3 years of winters she weathered in a heated building with adequate food, which she never once took for granted, and springs she welcomed with the specific appreciation of someone who has spent a winter in a hollow tree. She saved $38. She had identified the land she wanted in the first summer, a parcel on the ridge above the valley, not where the hollow oak stood, but close enough that she could walk there when she needed to. 6 acres south-facing with a small clearing that would take a cabin and a kitchen garden and not much else, which was all she needed. The owner was an old man in Elkhorn who had been meaning to sell it for years and kept not getting around to it. She went to him in the spring of her 3rd year at the mill with $35 and offered it for the land. He looked at her over the top of the conversation, the way people look at propositions they had not expected to find reasonable and are not sure how to respond to. He had been expecting she's supposed to sell to a man eventually. The notion of selling to a woman who had spent 3 years cooking for a mill crew had not been part of his anticipation. She waited him out, which she was good at. He took the $35. He had a deed drawn up at the land office, and she signed it, and it was signed back to her, and she walked out of the land office in Elkhorn with a piece of paper that had her name on it in the official ink of an official document in the company of the official stamp of the county of Kentucky, and no one she thought walking in the spring air with that paper inside her dress, no one would be putting 50 cents on a table and calling it settled. Not now, not for this. She built the cabin that summer. She built it slowly. She was 65 now, which was not old in the way that 25 thinks. 65 is old, but was not young in the way her body occasionally attempted to pretend. And she built it with the careful attention of someone who has lived in structures that were adequate and inadequate and understands the specific ways that each category makes itself felt over a winter. She chinked the walls twice. She built the chimney to draw correctly, which required 3 attempts in the advice of a man who built chimneys for a living and who charged her $2 for the consultation, which she considered $2 extremely well spent. By the time the first October frost arrived, she had 4 walls, a roof that shed water, a chimney that drew clean, a door that latched from inside, and a window on the south face that let the winter sun in during the middle of the day when it was most needed. It was small. It was hers. She sat in it on the first night with the fire burning correctly and the walls holding the warmth, the way walls that are properly built hold warmth, and she felt something that was not quite happiness and was not quite peace and was not quite vindication, but was somewhere among all 3 of them, a point equidistant from each, which had its own name that she had not yet decided on. She thought she would have time to decide on it. Opaline Greer died in 1899. Rowena heard about it from a woman in Elkhorn she had come to know over the years, not a friend exactly, but the kind of acquaintance that forms between capable women in a small community through the slow accumulation of mutual respect. Opaline had sold the farm finally the previous autumn for less than it was worth to buyers who knew she had no leverage. She had taken a room at the Elkhorn boarding house and lived there through the winter on what the sale had produced, which was not much. She had died in March, which struck Rowena as ironic in the way that certain outcomes are ironic, not cruelly, not satisfyingly, just as the simple observation that the thing and the season had found each other without her assistance. There was no one to arrange the funeral. Rowena heard this and sat with it for a while in the way she sat with most things that required consideration before response. She sat with it through the afternoon and into the evening, and by the following morning she had decided. She went to Elkhorn and paid for the funeral. A proper one, a box of decent wood, a minister who said the appropriate things over it, a plot in the churchyard that was not in the best section, but was not the worst either. She made the arrangements with the undertaker in the straightforward manner of someone conducting necessary business, and paid what was asked without negotiation, because the amount was not so large that negotiation was the point, and because negotiation was not the point. The woman who had become her acquaintance heard about it and came to find her and asked with the directness of someone who has decided that this particular question deserves a direct answer, why she had done it. Rowena thought about how to explain it simply, which was always how she preferred to explain things. Because I wanted everyone in this town who needed to know, she said, to know. The acquaintance considered this for a moment and then nodded in the manner of someone who has understood something without requiring it to be elaborated. The hollow oak fell in the autumn of 1906. She was 82 years old, and she made the walk up to the ridge because she needed to make it the way you need to do certain things, not because they are practical, but because they are part of the accounting that a long life requires. The hip was worse than it had been, and she used a stick now on uncertain terrain, and the ridge was uncertain terrain in October. She made it anyway. She had been making things anyway for 40 years, and she saw no reason to stop. The tree had come down in a summer storm, lightning the trapper's son who ran his father's circuit had told her. It had stood for the strike and then come down in the aftermath, which she thought was not an inappropriate way to end 3 centuries of existing. The trunk lay on the forest floor, massive, even horizontal. Its length greater than she had fully understood when it was vertical, its bark already beginning its return to the forest floor it had been drawing from all those years. She stood beside it for a long time. The interior was exposed now. The hollow chamber she had lived in for 5 months opened to the October sky for the first time since before anyone living could remember. The heartwood walls were smooth and dark. The floor of the chamber was covered in old leaf debris, the debris of decades since she had cleared it and laid pine boughs and survived. A small animal had made use of the space at some point she could see from the evidence on the floor, which pleased her in a way she did not try to explain. She put her hand on the exposed heartwood wall. It was cold. Of course it was cold, and it had been cold since the tree fell in summer and the season had moved on without it. But the smoothness was the same, the specific smoothness of old heartwood that has been the interior of something living for centuries. And her hand knew it without her having to think about it. The hand of an 82-year-old woman who had put this same hand against this same wood on a morning in late October 1886 and decided because of what she felt that the answer to her problem was already here. She did not cry. She was not someone who cried easily, and she had used up whatever crying she had left on Clement, which was the only expenditure of it she had ever found fully justified. She stayed for a long time. The October light moved through the trees the same way it always moved through trees in October on this ridge at the long angle of the season, making the air visible in its slant and the dust motes in the slant visible too. Everything clear and cold and carrying the particular quality of the dying year that she had come to recognize as one of the beautiful things which it was. She had been 62 years old when she first stood in that chamber. She was 82 now, 20 years. 20 years of Fridays and dollars in the cabin on the south-facing slope, in the kitchen garden that produced what it produced, and the winters weathered in a heated room that was small but hers. 20 years of being, by any measure, she respected herself. She took her hand off the heartwood and turned to go down. The stick found its purchase on the ridge soil. The hip complained, and she managed it and started moving one step and then the next, the way she had always moved through the things that were difficult. Halfway down the ridge, she stopped and looked back once. The fallen tree lay in the hollow massive and still returning to what it had come from, the way everything returns eventually. The exposed chamber caught the afternoon light and held it for a moment, the smooth dark walls gathering what warmth October offered and keeping it inside the same way they had always done, the same way they would continue to do for as long as the wood held together and the walls stood and the air inside remained still. Still air holds heat. She had known that for 20 years now. She had known it in the way you know the things that kept you alive, not as a fact you remembered, but as something your body carried, permanent and unlosable, purchased at a price you would not have chosen to pay and could not have afforded to refuse. She turned back down the ridge. The cabin was a mile below. The fire would need to be built before dark. There was a meal to make, and the morning's work to think about, and the next Friday with its dollar, which she still counted, though she no longer needed to, because counting it was the practice of a discipline she had earned and did not intend to abandon. The ridge held her weight on the way down. It had always held her weight. The hills, Clement had told her on a September afternoon with the valley spread below them like something offered, the hills don't throw anybody out. He had been right. She had tested the claim more thoroughly than he had probably intended when he made it, but he had been right. She came down through the trees and across the clearing and opened in the cabin door and went inside. The cabin was cold from the day she kept the fire low when she was away, but it was hers, small and solid and correctly chinked, and it would be warm again in half an hour. She built the fire. She sat down with her hands around the warmth of it while it grew, the way she had sat with cups of coffee in a kitchen that was not hers 40 years ago, doing the mathematics of what remained. What remained now was not nothing. That was the arithmetic she had spent 20 years working out, one coin at a time, one winter at a time, one Friday at a time. What remained was enough. Not the enough of abundance, never that, and she had made her peace with never that long ago, but the enough of sufficiency, the enough of a woman who had been given 50 cents and told that was the sum of her value, and who had taken that assessment out into the hills in the winter and the years and come back with a different number. The fire settled into its work. The cabin walls absorbed the warmth and held it. The smoke rose clean from the chimney that had taken 3 attempts to get right straight up into the October air, visible against the darkening sky from the valley below. She had built something from nothing. And when nothing was all she had, that had been enough to start.